I'm Jonathan Platt, the event manager at the Committee for Academic Freedom. We are a non-partisan organisation dedicated to protecting freedom of speech, teaching and research in UK universities. We were founded 2 years ago by our director, Edward Skidelsky, who will be chairing our final panel this afternoon, Disagreeing Well, Civility and Its Limits. We're very proud to introduce our first ever conference, the first of many we hope, Navigating Academic Freedom, Perils and Prospects. We've brought together a cast of highly distinguished academics, public intellectuals and campaigners to share insights on the key threats to academic freedom of our time and explore thoughtful, evidence-based strategies for safeguarding it amid current challenges. The day will consist of 4 panel discussions and a keynote speech by Professor Arif Ahmed, the Director of Freedom of Speech and Academic Freedom at the Office for Students. You can find more information about the panel speakers and timings in the conference packs, which most of you will have picked up from the info desk. So yeah, just in terms of practical information, there will be a buffet lunch from 12:45 till 2 p.m. taking place in the wardroom through that corridor, which most of you will already have found for the teas and coffees. And there's access to the beautiful outdoor deck area with stunning views of the Thames and Tower Bridge, which you've probably already seen. There are breakout rooms for journalists and film crew for interviewing the speakers, and those are accessible via a corridor at the back of the hall, marked journalists and film crew only, and there are 2 rooms accessible through the corridor, one with a sign on the door marked journalists and another with a sign marked film crew. So male and female toilets are through that corridor, the corridor leading to the dining area, and there's also a disabled toilet just along that wall there as well. And there will be an info desk, the same one where we handed out your lanyards. There'll be an info desk available at all time. There'll be someone there during breaks and lunch for if you have any questions. And also there'll be a drinks and canapes reception in the wardroom along the corridor at the end of the day as well. So I'll now hand over to David Goodhart, who will be chairing our first panel, Battlegrounds of Knowledge, Threats to Academic Freedom in the West. David Goodhart is a British journalist, author, former editor of Prospect magazine, who served as a commissioner to the board of the Equality and Human Rights Commission since 2020. He has written extensively on issues of identity, immigration, and social cohesion, and has authored 3 books, including The Road to Somewhere, The New Tribes Shaping British Politics, published in 2017. So I'll just hand over now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So, well, let's get going. This first session is obviously on the kind of the narrower aspect of free speech and higher education. And we've got kind of almost the general staff of the free speech movement up here on the stage. Some of you have some remarkable stories to tell, particularly perhaps Ulrike. Anyway, let me just briefly introduce the generals here. Jacob Mchangama is a Danish human rights lawyer, founder and executive director of the Future of Free Speech, a research professor at Vanderbilt University. Took part in a very, very good debate on free speech I listened to just the other day on Yasha Monk's podcast, The Good Fight, which I really recommend. Next to Jacob is Toby Young, who everybody in the UK will know. Extraordinary, really, to think about it, a member of the House of Lords, Toby Young. Yes, you still have to kind of pinch yourself, really, don't you? But he's been an extraordinarily brave figure in the on the free speech front line, founder and director of the Free Speech Union. which has grown in size enormously in recent months, as I'm sure Toby will tell us all about. Next to Toby is Nadine Strossen, who is New York Law School professor and a senior fellow, most relevant, I think, senior fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, the American Free Speech Organization. And to my right, Ulrike Guérot, who I knew many years ago in Bonn, who was once a leading member of the German intellectual establishment and then said a few non-mainstream things about COVID and about Ukraine and suffered, and Gaza, and suffered an extraordinary level of persecution, was thrown out of her university, the University of Bonn, and is, I think, still pursuing her case through the courts. Anyway, Ulrike will tell you more about that in a few minutes. It's an extraordinary story and gives us some perspective on what's happening in continental Europe. But I guess probably much of our focus today, in this session anyway, is going to be on higher education in the US and the UK. Obviously, higher education in recent decades not been known exactly for its viewpoint diversity, but we're now kind of in the attempted pushback against what one might call the Kathleen Stock or the Ulrike Guérot problem. And I guess the issue is, are we merely replacing one form of institutional bias and speech restraint with another, perhaps particularly relevant in the US? It's very, very early days, obviously, for the UK, the higher education freedom of speech law. What's the acronym? HEFSA. I think it only came into law in August, so it's only been going for a few weeks, so it's a bit early to tell what sort of effect it's happening. But I mean, we will, I hope, discuss that. And of course, in America, President Trump has announced this compact, the attempt by the Trump government to transform higher education. Is it just replacing one form of tyranny with another? I guess is the issue. I mean, we want to have a conversation rather than lots of set-piece speeches, but I think it probably is a good idea if everybody starts off with a couple of minutes at least reflecting on particularly the situation in higher education. Would you go first, Jacob?
Yes, thank you so much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I think there was a defining moment for me was when there was a hearing on anti-Semitism, and you had a number of university presidents in the United States hauled before Congress to talk about what they did about anti-Semitism. And all of them had suddenly transformed into clones of Nadine Strossen. They were sort of insistent that they all lived up, even if they were private university. You had Harvard, you had MIT, and so on. They essentially had internalized the First Amendment, so that meant that they would allow students and faculty to say very, very outrageous and offensive things, even if they didn't support those things. And sort of, I think Nadine can correct me, sort of the way that they talked about free speech at that particular hearing was what you had wanted a university president to say. The only problem was that to everyone there, it was completely obvious that they were being disingenuous, that in fact they had not been Nadine Strossen's when it came to all kinds of other topics than anti-Semitism, that when it came to transgender, racism against African Americans, all kinds of other topics that were seen as offensive by various groups, these universities had adopted standards that were a far cry from the First Amendment. And that was sort of what has, I think, undone a lot of elite American universities because they have essentially shied away from the principle of free speech and academic freedom and made it a lot easier for forces to come in and say, you know, universities are a mess, we need to do something about it, including, I think, currently policies that are as illiberal as some of the illiberal tendencies that they are meant to fight against. But essentially, a lot of the credibility that these universities were supposed to be the guardians of, they themselves have contributed to eroding. But of course, and this is a principle that is generally applicable when it comes to free speech, is that you don't fight censorship with censorship. But I think there's probably a lot less sympathy for these organizations because they are elite institutions. They were supposed to be the best available repositories of knowledge. They have, to a certain extent, undermined that, eroded the very principles that underpin that position, and therefore paved the way for some of these illiberal approaches. But I am quite worried about the direction of the Trump administration. Some of the policies that are being suggested seem to be more punitive, more geared towards culture war rather than a genuine interest in reforming higher ed. Even if some of the goals are laudable, sort of getting the state in there to police opinion is, I think, a cure worse than the disease. And even if you're completely on board on everything that the Trump administration is doing now, the question is always, when it comes to free speech and academic freedom, well, are you then also going to be on board when in 4 or 8 years you have a new president, you have a new majority in Congress, and they're then going to say, well, thanks for paving the way. Now we're going to take wokeism to new extremes and impose that with state power. And if you are on board with the current, use of state power, then you have very little credibility if you go back and say, well, that's the wrong way. Then you're essentially putting yourself in the same situation that the university presidents that were hauled before Congress were, that had very little credibility when they were trying to channel their inner Nadine Strossens.
So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about HEFSA and where we are with it, in case not everyone here is fully up to date. To put it in context, there were some legal protections for academic freedom and free speech on campus on the statute books thanks to the 1986 number 2 Education Act. But those protections were, I think, more honoured in the breach than the observance, in part because there weren't adequate enforcement complaint mechanisms. The Free Speech Union and other pro-free speech organizations and a group of pro-free speech academics drafted a kind of white paper, I think as far back as 2020, possibly 2021, which then became a white paper about how to better protect free speech and academic freedom on English university campuses, because, as you know, education is a devolved area of administration. And that blueprint eventually became the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill. Amongst other things, it did introduce 2 enforcement mechanisms. One was a complaint scheme whereby if you felt your university was breaching its new, slightly more robust duties to uphold academic freedom and free speech on campus, you could complain to the Office for Students. And in addition, a new statutory tort whereby you could sue your university in court. You wouldn't have to bring a judicial review, which is a complicated and expensive procedure and was pretty much the only way to get universities to comply with their duties under the 86 Act. It had a fairly tricky passage through Parliament. It was challenged in the House of Lords. At one point, the tort was stripped out, then it was put back in, but in a slightly reduced form. But anyway, with a lot of lobbying and deal-making and effort, it eventually got through. It received royal assent in 2023. But like much legislation, it had a phased commencement. So some of the less important parts of the Act were commenced, but the most important clauses were due to be commenced on 1st of August 2024, and Rishi Sunak, in his wisdom, decided to call a snap election before August 1st, 2024, which meant that when Bridget Phillipson, the new Education Secretary, got her feet under the desk, almost the first thing she did was to pause all the commencement orders, which were due to bring all the most important clauses of HEFSA into effect. The Free Speech Union then brought a judicial review against Bridget Phillipson for what we thought was an unlawful decision, and we had two arguments. The more interesting one was that we thought that her pausing of the commencement orders was an example of a minister of the Crown defying the will of Parliament, which was a breach of a sacrosanct British constitutional principle, because it had received the assent of both houses of Parliament, it had received royal assent, and by ministerial fiat, she seemed to be defying the will of Parliament. Our second, slightly less interesting argument was that we didn't think she'd done an adequate equality impact assessment before taking the decision. About a week before the hearing was due to take place in the High Court in January, Bridget Phillipson did a partial U-turn and said she would be repealing some of the clauses. So she's repealed the tort, but she would be bringing others into effect. They would be commenced, and they were commenced on the 1st of August, including new, more robust registration requirements. So universities are now required to follow the guidance produced by the OFS about how to discharge their duties to comply with the new, more robust protections for free speech and academic freedom on campus. Some were kept under review, so there was a requirement for universities to disclose foreign funding above a certain amount designed to flush out Chinese influence in English universities, which, as I'm sure you know, is pretty profound. That's been kept under review. But importantly, the complaints clause, one of the two enforcement mechanisms, has not been repealed. And she hasn't said she's keeping that under review. Rather, she's going to wait until a suitable legislative vehicle hoves into view and then attach the clause implementing the complaint scheme, which has to be revised slightly, which is why it can't be commenced straight away. Attach it to that legislative vehicle and bring it into force. And we're hoping that's what she's going to do. Anyway, so we regard that as a victory. Albeit a partial victory, and we've withdrawn our claim, and we're now quarrelling with the government legal department about who has to pay the other's costs. But I hear from academics on the front line, many of whom are in this room, that the commencement of some of the clauses of HEFSA on August 1st are already having an important effect. So, for instance, various universities as part of their recruitment requirements, required applicants, both internal and external, for jobs to effectively pay fealty to equity, diversity, and inclusion. They had to say what they were doing to promote this sacred holy trinity in their work as a condition of being employed. Anyway, what is William Mackessy's organisation called? Academics for Academic Freedom? No, it's Alumni for Academic Freedom. I think, is that right? Anyway, they wrote to the various universities insisting on these various EDI loyalty oaths, and they've now withdrawn them because they're not compatible with the new OFS guidance. So that, I think, is an important victory, and I think we're beginning to see universities behave much better just as a result of HEFSA being brought into force. I mean, just one final point. Many people said, what's the point of changing the law? The law is downstream from culture. The real battle is to change the culture on university campuses. To which our response was, well, changing the law helps. And it can have a profound impact on culture on campus. Just look at the impact of the Equality Act. That was a change to the law in 2010, had a profound cultural impact across the board, but particularly in universities. So I think it will have an impact, and it is a minor victory. It's probably, I was just saying to Nadine, the only bit of good news on the free speech front in the UK in the past 5, 6, 7 years, but at least I think it is good news, and it is having an impact.
It really is. Well, I would like to join my co-panelists in thanking the organizers and conveners of this really important gathering. Edward and Jonathan are the ones with whom I have most often dealt. Here in the UK, I think of Winston Churchill and one of his many witty quotes about a difference between an optimist and a pessimist. So the pessimist sees the problem with every opportunity, whereas the optimist sees the opportunity in every problem. And that's where I am with the severe problems that we are facing, not only in the United States, but around the world on the academic freedom front. But I think they truly do present an extraordinary opportunity for reasons that Jakob alluded to, that the tables have turned, and these are generalizations, but largely correct. Those on the left who have been dominant on campuses in the United States and therefore impervious to complaints about violations of free speech and academic freedom are starting to get religion. That said, we can go in two directions, and unfortunately there seems to be a lot of tit for tat and ratcheting down. So we now have not only an ongoing culture war from the left, it's still ongoing on campus, but also a ramped up culture war from the right, plus an unprecedented assertion of governmental power to the extent of even seeking, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Donald Trump is seeking to nationalize universities. And when you were talking, Toby, about the division of power between the executive and the legislative branch, we certainly have that in the United States, that in addition to Trump taking actions that are violating academic freedom, he's also bypassing the legislative branch. So let me say a little bit about this, what I see as a perfect storm of ongoing culture war from and cancel culture from the left, the new cancel culture from the right, and unprecedented threats from Trump. In terms of the ongoing self-censorship that is pervasive on US campuses among students and faculty, mostly afraid to voice views that are even questioning of so-called progressive orthodoxy. We have an extraordinarily recent and detailed data set. FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, Jakob and I are both senior fellows with this organization. On September 9th, 70,000 students were surveyed on 257 campuses. And the surveys show that on the most important topics, students not overwhelmingly, but by significant majorities or pluralities, say they cannot have a candid conversation on their campus about these topics. And that means not only in classrooms, but even in informal settings, such as cafeterias. Now, you won't be surprised that the #1 taboo topic was Israel-Gaza, weighing in at 53%. But on many campuses, including Barnard, which is part of Columbia, right around the corner from where my husband and I live, 90% of students said they could not have a candid conversation. Meanwhile, they're shouting slogans at each other in protest, but not what we would consider an exercise of academic freedom. Number two, I was really surprised. The second most self-censored topic was abortion. And 42% of students said they could not frankly discuss that subject. And the list goes on, but let me tell you one of particular concern, and that is free speech. 20% of students said they could not candidly discuss this controversial topic. And to add one little fine point to it, there was a separate question about hate speech. 27% said they couldn't talk about hate speech. So when 20% say they can't talk about free speech, they mean just plain free speech, not even hate speech. And I know that academic freedom is adjacent to the concern of free speech. But if people, students and faculty members, members of the campus community, cannot freely exercise a free speech right, which is very strongly protected in law in our country, then there is no meaningful academic freedom at all. And so I do see the two topics as being very, very closely intertwined. Now let me get to the second point of right-wing cancel culture, which has emerged most dramatically, most recently, in the wake of the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk, an exponent of free speech from a conservative, some would say right-wing perspective. I don't know enough about his views to know what label is correct. But as a result of making statements that are perceived as being insufficiently respectful of Charlie Kirk, there has been a massive number of calls for firing and actually firing all kinds of employees, including faculty members, including tenured faculty members. And some of this pressure has come expressly from government officials at every level of government, most ironically, J.D. Vance, who famously and mostly correctly scolded Europeans for not adhering to free speech. But, you know, hypocrisy, I think, inconsistency is a theme that is running throughout all of our observations, putting pressure on looking for, searching out comments online that are insufficiently respectful. And the last survey I saw indicated that several dozen faculty members, including tenured ones, had suffered some kind of adverse impact. Now, last but far from least, that brings us to Donald Trump. I fully agree that many of the changes to universities that he has been fostering are changes that those of us who have been advocating for academic freedom from the inside have been championing. But not only does the end not justify the means, as Jakob indicated, but what the means are, in this case, not only illegal, violating the statutes that are supposedly being enforced, or sometimes not even alluding to any statute, just acting straightforwardly through executive fiat, so-called executive orders, completely by ignoring due process and the rule of law. And really, you know, a professor at Yale Law School, I think, really put his finger on it when he said Trump really doesn't care about First Amendment or other law because his model is not operating through the rule of law. His model is the art of the deal, right? He is a deal maker. He's using the kinds of pressures, including extortionate pressures, to which many universities can't say no. This latest Compact for Excellence sounds very good, and I know my friend Anna Krylov is here. I'm not sure if she's here yet. You wrote something about, many of us support the goals and the aims of this agenda, but the mechanism for implementing it is not an exaggeration to say a federal takeover. Let me just mention one provision, which is at the very end, it's the enforcement provision, that there would be ongoing federal oversight of every aspect of the university, from admissions, through curriculum, through hiring, through, at the level of every single department, every single class. And anytime there is a complaint, without any mention of any due process, there can be retroactive defunding of all government funds. Plus, as if that's not enough, private donors who have given money to the university can demand a refund. So, this is, I don't see how any university can agree to it. That said, I'm going to end on the positive note, the opportunity here. Somebody I admire a great deal, Danielle Allen, who's a professor at Harvard University, who has been a great advocate of academic freedom. She wrote a very provocative and I think worth reading essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education, in which she said, this is an extraordinary opportunity for universities. They should completely reject the compact, but they should use it as a wake-up call to form their own coalition to negotiate for a new framework for a relationship between government and universities, incorporating many of these reforms, and then propose it as legislation to Congress so that we would go through the actual appropriate legal process. And I just want to thank everybody here, because I see this as this gathering as taking advantage of the opportunity that is being presented by the challenges we all face.
Thank you, Nadine. So, grounds for some optimism in the UK and kind of tit for tat in the US seems to be the situation so far. But Ulrike, let's hear your story and perhaps some more general reflections on academic freedom in Germany and perhaps the rest of continental Europe, to the extent that you know the scene there.
So first, let me thank you all for having me here in London. It's the first time I'm back since Brexit, actually. I came many times before 2016, but then much less. And I know David from so many conferences before that time. And I must say, and this is a compliment to British society, the few hours I spent here, with the things that we had all in head about Brexit and what it would do to the country, I just find a very lovely, London sparkling sort of ambience, which was really surprising me yesterday. And I'm also very happy to see young people here, because in Germany, many of the discussions about academic freedom are also generational dividing lines. You have the older people who are basically complaining about it, and the younger people are in other discourses. So I'm very happy to experience this. And yes, so what is happening in Germany? First, I would really like to strengthen that I'm not the only one. I'm perhaps one of the most famous cases. There are lots of articles about me in the internet, for instance. Also in English, an article, State Enemy Number 1, which you can find in the internet, which brought my case also up to the European Court, but let's go there in a minute. It's very important to me to point you to a book which is called Disrupting the University. It's a sociological study with lots of figures written by Heike Egner. And it basically is describing some 60 cases since the past 5 years where you have dismissals like me from one day to the other from university. Statistically interesting is that those dismissed, people like me, 2/3 of them are women. It's very interesting, yeah. But even more interesting, the significant statistical factor for throwing somebody out of a university is what you call bildungsfern. So if you make a career out of parents which are non-academic and you become academic. So this is interesting because if we are now, and you said it, Nadine, we are talking about institutional hijacking of discourses through money, through the universities, through funding, and so you could make the argument that elites are closing their discourses, with a dividing line towards the people who most of the time have different opinions, yeah. And if then you see that in the study I was mentioning from Heike Egner, Disrupting the Universities, that the professors who come from the people, from low and go up, those are fired, then there is an argument to make. There is an argument to make about elites closing their discourses, because in Germany, you can basically, the sensitive discourses which are heating up the society are migration, is wokeness, is Gaza, is Ukraine, is corona measures, and it's climate. These are the things where you could make the argument that you have, say, elite discourses about necessary measures for climate change, necessary measures for changing the language in wokeness, necessary measures for corona, necessary measures for war, which is all the same pattern, necessary measures which are elite discourses. Then you go to experts, they say these are the figures, we must do this and that, and then you're basically hijacking the institutions, the universities, and most of these discourses are against the, say, stomach feeling of broader society, who say Gaza, we do not want to see this, Ukraine, we do not want to go to war, corona measures were too heavy, climate, let's cool down a little bit. You see my point, I hope, yeah? So it's very important, again, to go back to this book, Disrupting the University. And it's, I think, very important to understand that in terms of hijacking the institutions, that it goes with funding. If you look at EU funding for climate discourse, for wokeness, for the foundations who are you are basically doing or impacting these discourses, the money flows are very, very, very important. Yeah? And what we see in Germany is that there's a system closing on discourses. So when I say I'm not the only one, to give you this, in Germany there's obviously free speech. The problem is you are sanctioned. Yeah? I was dismissed, like many others, 60s in the study. But on Corona, for instance, the guy who did the anti-Corona demonstrations in Germany, he was sitting 9 months in trial in Untersuchungshaft, yeah, because he was accused for tax exemption for 700,000 euros. And after 9 months of prison and 76 negotiation days at the court, they found €19.53. And then he was freed. Just to give you this one, yeah, 9 months in prison for nothing, for 19 euros. If 19 euros is the tax exemption level, you can put 90% of Germany's in prison, yeah, because everybody has a tax bill or a taxi cab bill, which is not sane, okay? So then you come to my case. It's a little bit the same. I have something, it's all on my website, you can look it up, there's a link, and my fraud is sort of public since 3 years. There's something like 10 mistakes in a non-academic book, where, because I wrote this book in three weeks very quickly, in which book there's no mistakes. So the volume of mistakes, if you count the words of mistakes to the volume of the book, there's something like 1.5% mistakes in a non-academic book, which I wrote before I was hired at university. Yeah? And then I came up with 2 books, one on Corona, one on Ukraine in 22. And the book, which I had written years before, was a best-selling book. It was translated, by the way, in English, yeah? 8 times, whatever. The book was on the market with 80,000 sellings, whatever. You could have found 10 years, you could have found mistakes in the book if you had wanted to find mistakes in the book, yeah? But by chance, they found 10 mistakes in the book after I spoke out on the corona measures, because I wrote another book in which I had my doubts about what was happening. By the way, today you would argue that I was right, because we have the so-called Robert Koch Institute protocols, yeah? Robert Koch Institute is our health institute that basically navigated the government through the measures. And you can clearly see in the 2,000 pages files that politics ignored the recommendation of the Robert Koch Institute. So basically, I was right in my book on this discussion, you would say today. And then I wrote in 22 a second book on Ukraine and the war, and since Maidan, the prehistory, what happened, because I'm, you know, David, an expert on European policy. I know Charles Grant, I know most of the European foreign policy crowd of the UK. I knew before 2016, yeah. So I was a very, you know, I'm totally mainstream women. I traveled with our president. I have l'Ordre pour le Mérite, so I'm sort of a distinguished person, yeah. So, but after these two books, they found the 10 mistakes in the old book, and from one day to the other, I was fired. With no salary, February 2023, dismissal from university. So you need to survive this. I mean, it's hard to lose your existence from one day to the other, yeah. But in addition, the shitstorming, the manufactured shitstorming, is quite a thing. I mean, if you experienced over a month that you are thrown for plagiarism and you have this algorithmic and the bots and the AI, which is basically keeping you down, you don't do anything. I mean, if you're a single individual and you are not a tech-affine sort of elderly woman and you don't, you see my point. I mean, there's something really technological about it, how the AI works, how the algorithm works, and you are just down-talked. You are just liquidated in the internet. That's it. If you look at my Wikipedia account, better not, you know. I read my Wikipedia account and I felt nobody asked me. I mean, that's not. And then it goes on and on, yeah. And if they cannot, if it's not enough to throw things on me, then now it's on my father, even on my grandfather, to make a point that, say, since a century, all my family is bad. I mean, it's really totally weird. And you may laugh on this, but if you experience it for, say, 2 years, honestly, it's not nice. It's really not nice, yeah? So there is a real point here. And again, I would like to say, not only about me. I know many friends, I said there's free speech in Germany, but perhaps make it more analytically. There's sanctioning, yeah? And either you lose your job, or, for instance, you have like Unheard or Grey Zone, one of these, you know, alternative media format. They close your bank account because these alternative media formats work with donations. Yeah, give us donations for our work. We do investigative journalism. Yeah, but if then those people who do this work, they are losing their bank account, they cannot do the work. Yeah. And, or for instance, the European Union now sanctions two German who are sitting in St. Petersburg, yeah? Tom Röpers, who is a guy who is having also a media format, Tom Röpers Anti-Spiegel, yeah? And in the last sanction packet of the European Union sanctioned Alena Lipp and Tom Röpers, which are two German citizens, basically because they have blocks, one in Moscow, the other in St. Petersburg, closing the bank accounts and basically stating that these persons have no right of entry into Germany again. I mean, this is clearly against any human rights standard of the European Court to interdict that two German citizens have not the ability with a German passport to re-enter the German border. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, the real question is why Germany is so going particularly nuts on all these things, I must say. And we may discuss this, yeah. But again, closing bank accounts, doing citizens regulations via sanctions, dismissals, losing jobs, or infringements with court cases, like I told about Ballweg, you know, the 19 euros, means that there is a media system and a court system which is going clearly, how's the word, nuts? I mean, which is no longer functioning, yeah? So there is a institutional bias, there is unfortunately, you know, sort of a tandem thing between, in my case, between the media and the court. And I would argue that in my case, because I lost the case at the second court level just last Wednesday, and the thing is that now, not only I lost it for the second time, but the second court level didn't allow me the revision for the next level. So they did a judgment which, in the opinion of some 15 lawyers, is totally weird, but they didn't allow me now to go to the third level. So it's not only that they do weird judgments, but then they don't allow the revision, which normally in a Rechtsstaat, in a situation of law where you have transparency, you should be able to go upwards. Yeah.
Could I just say one thing, Ulrike? When you say why Germany in particular, I'm not sure everybody knows that Germany really was the inventor of the modern concept of academic freedom in the 19th century. It became as Germany had great research universities and founded the concept of freedom of research and freedom of study and freedom of teaching, that was imported to the United States by faculty members, especially at the University of Chicago, who had studied in Europe. So I think it's particularly tragic to see the degradation in Germany.
But what I find so shocking is the degree of consensus there seemed to be behind this movement. I mean, the fact that there was no, Spiegel, or there seemed to be no newspaper that would support you. You thought, the kind of the Querdenker sort of, somebody in the system would stick up for you, and that there would be some argument about it. And I mean, after all, I remember thinking at the time of COVID, God, how Germany has changed, because you actually had the biggest demonstrations, I think I'm right in saying, in Europe against lockdowns. You had, 700,000 people took to the streets, I think, on one occasion. I mean, the fact that nobody is listening to anybody outside of a pretty narrow consensus on these issues. I mean, that is what is so shocking in some ways.
Well, there were big demonstrations also in France and in Genoa in Italy, but one point which I think, when you say where's the support and where's the accusation sort of thing, the fault line in society, when I started talking, I said congratulations to the British society that a thing like Brexit, which I think was very harmful for British society, and you overcame it in a way. I mean, I'm just feeling like you managed to do it, yeah? What my feeling since 8 hours. The thing is that for whatever reason, I would argue that the German society through COVID didn't come through, or less good than many other societies. I'm traveling a lot. I was in Spain. I was recently in Barcelona. My kids are living in Paris, Sweden, Italy, My argument here, why is what we call contactual, so the guilt of being in contact. Now I'm under contactual, so it's you are guilty if you are talking to me, So because if you talk to me, you're also as nasty as me, So, and this is, I think, pretty much what you call denunciantentum, so denounce somebody. My argument would be that there is a specific, whatever gene in German society that you denounce your neighbor. I know from Corona, from my Italian, Spanish, French friends, that whether they believe these COVID things or not, or whether they stick to the rules or not, whatever, but they didn't denounce the neighbor, And the Germans were denouncing, and because there were lots of denouncing, he has 5 people in the house and only 3 are allowed, whatever. We did it for 3 years. I mean, we finished these measures, the last country, Most of the countries had finished it since 2 years, and then we were still going on. And that has now a traumatism in society. And the traumatism is not healed. It's not healed as long as we don't allow open discussions about it. And we don't, because now the discussion is whether we have enquete commissions, whether we have enquete commissions in the Bundestag, and all this is, avoided, But let's come back, because that's essentially my answer to your question. Because you have the feeling that the German society needs to put things under the carpet. Carpet.
Ulrike, this is not just German, if I may intervene. I mean, your really distressing tale has been recounted so many times by American professors at the most prestigious universities who have been shunned and shamed and lost their jobs and ostracized and become toxic. You can't publicly associate with them. And every every single one of them makes exactly the same point, that none of my colleagues is speaking up for me. They will tell me privately, I really support you. I really defend your rights, but I dare not say it. Even tenured faculty members are taking that posture. So in the United States a few years ago, recognizing this problem, a new organization was founded called the Academic Freedom Alliance, and I'm sure the academic freedom organizations here do something similar, which is it's a completely multi-partisan, cross-ideological group of professors for many disciplines, many different kinds of universities, and we pledge that we will stand up and speak up for whoever the assailed faculty member is, even if we disagree with what they're saying. Because what's at stake is academic freedom, which, as the United States Supreme Court has repeatedly said, and we have to remind people of this, is not just for the benefit of those of us who are members of the academic community. Our larger society depends on a robust academic freedom for the pursuit of truth in science and philosophy and every other field. So I think, I'm preaching to the choir here, but just to say, even something that seems so small as associating with Ulrike and others like her and speaking up, even though it may damage our reputation, but what is our reputation for? What is our tenure for?
Just one sentence, because societal behavior is the one thing, contactual, guilt of contact, yeah? But the assumption would have been, and that's why I put my case to court, and second level, I mean, two years and a half, if you're a single mother, the court cost, I mean, this is quite a battle, yeah? And I really was trusting into the German court system. I must say, I'm a good German citizen. I think I'm a very good German citizen, yeah? So I was trusting in my courts. Now I must see that if I'm believing something like 20 lawyers, because I'm quite known, so I have lawyers who look at my case for pro bono, yeah? And they all say, this is insane what is happening. And still I must see that the secondary court level basically ruled against me, yeah? What I'm also seeing, and here it becomes important, I give you that example which I think is very important. We wanted, the Bundestag just wanted, the SPD, Social Democrats wanted to propose somebody for the court of Karlsruhe, a lawyer, yeah? Frau Brosius-Gersthoff. She's one of these woke women lawyers, blah, 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 30-something, and she was proposed by the SPD to become court lawyer in Karlsruhe, our constitutional court, yeah? And then because there was a lot of emotions against her, because on abortion topics and wokeness, and many people feel like she want to rule out abortion until the ninth month of pregnancy, whatever, there was huge things against her, and it was difficult to place her at the court, right? And then they found plagiarism, right? Much more than in 1.5 mistakes, yeah? 20-30% of her dissertation, for me it was a non-academic book, yeah? 20-30% of her dissertation apparently are plagiarism, yeah? She didn't she didn't go at the court, obviously, the rumor that it was too much against her, but she's still professor in Hamburg. And nobody is going against that there are so many mistakes, but she stays professor in Hamburg, yeah? So the University of Hamburg now does an alibi commission, and the alibi commission is basically will be saying, yes, there are some mistakes in her things, but this is still academic. So what I'm saying here, there is legal asymmetry, and legal asymmetry, I mean, beyond the behavior in society. If you have legal asymmetry, the law is for the ones with the right opinion, you allow every mistake, and the ones with the wrong opinion, the tiniest mistake becomes whatever, life destruction, then there's no more law, there's no more legal system, yeah? And that is the problem in Germany now.
So is there any possibility that your experience could trigger any sort of academic freedom movement in Germany? I mean, is there anything positive that can come out of your miserable experience?
Well, I mean, first, as long as I know, there is not an institutionalized association now as I see here, so compliments for this. I have been now joining the academic board of a Swiss organization because I'm also pretty known in Switzerland, so I'm very happy to be there, that it's at least the German language sort of community, yeah. There is a German association called Wissenschaftsfreiheit.org. You can Google this on, Wissenschaftsfreiheit, so libertyofscience.org, yeah. But to be very honest, and I was one of the founding members 3 or 4 years ago, but it also has been hijacked, yeah. It basically has been hijacked because it's a network that started off with, I mean, which is basically only doing the wokeness thing. Yeah, the cultural war on wokeness, they do in this. But if you come with Gaza, Ukraine, Corona, climate, then even the network for academic freedom is basically going behind you or didn't defend me. Yeah.
Just coming back to Britain and America, I mean, Toby, you kind of implied that that we may be sort of past peak. What would one call it? Past peak ideological conformity in the university. You know, the fact that the DEI loyalty oaths are no longer required, and so on and so forth. I mean, is there? Is that really the case? And might that even be the case in America? I mean, notwithstanding the sort of Schmittian sort of tit-for-tat battles that are going on there on this issue, that actually things broadly are getting better.
Yeah. Well, whenever I say yes, we've reached peak woke, the pendulum has begun to swing back, then things get worse by an order of magnitude. So I'm a little bit hesitant. So I'm going to censor you. Like Nadine, I absolutely recognise your story. About 12% of the Free Speech Union's 4,500 plus cases we've taken on in the past 5.5 years, about 12% have been at universities. And most of them students, but not all. I think I checked with our case team, and we've defended about 160 academics. Many of them in a similar position to you. And you raised the interesting question, David, of why, and Nadine too, why is it that academics who in private sympathise with you will publicly denounce you? I wrote about this in the Standard and then produced a longer version in the Daily Sceptic yesterday, and invoked Steven Pinker's concept of common knowledge to partly explain this. It's not the whole of the story, but I think it does provide some insight, which is the fact that not everyone signs up to the prevailing orthodoxies in the various hot-button issues you flagged up: Ukraine, COVID, trans issues, Gaza, abortion, etc. The fact that the orthodoxies are actually not nearly as prevalent as people imagine is not common knowledge. So people feel quite isolated in dissenting from the prevailing orthodoxy, and because they think they are in a tiny minority, they feel obliged to pay fealty to what they understand the orthodoxy to be, in the hope of preserving themselves, saving their own careers. You see this mechanism all the time. I think Václav Havel came up with the example of the greengrocer in Czechoslovakia when it was still a communist country. The greengrocer puts a sign in his window saying, "Workers of the world unite," even though he has long since lost his faith in Marxist-Leninism. But he wants to advertise that he is still a member of the faithful, and the customers, who have also lost their faith, don't realize that everyone has lost their faith, so they pay fealty to this sign in the window too. And lots of academics have effectively become Havel's greengrocer, paying fealty to a dogma they no longer believe in, because the fact that it isn't believed in isn't common knowledge. And one of the grounds for hope, I think, is that organizations like the Committee for Academic Freedom, Alumni for Academic Freedom, Academics for Academic Freedom, the Free Speech Union, we have our own alphabet army now. I think it's gradually, the ice is beginning to melt people are beginning to understand that actually dissenters, heretics, are much more widespread than they'd hitherto understood, and that emboldens them to speak up and come to the defense of, academics being mobbed. So I think we are beginning to see, we're far from a Berlin Wall moment in which you have a kind of preference falsification collapse, a cascade. But I think events like this, the fact that we're beginning to organize, protect each other, safety in numbers, pooling risk, I think that's all helping.
Can I say something? I think there's also a face-keeping thing here, yeah? Because if you say that so many academics have been going into orthodoxy, gender studies, climate, whatever, yeah? Climate is very interesting, yeah? Because there are 79% of climate researchers who agree on, yeah? You would say if science is a discourse, 79% is a high number for... normally it's not 97%, yeah? So now you have the first Nobel Prize winning people 158 who have been doing a manifesto, yeah? The math is wrong. The math is wrong, yeah? I have a very good friend in Marseille who's a mathematician who says in the CCPR report, if you want to calculate climate data, the modeling, you need to have the worst scenario to take these figures to do the model. And if you don't take the worst scenario figures, you can't do your modeling, or your research is not published in Science and Nature. Yeah. So then we have a real question: why do you need to take these figures? We should be allowed to take any figures, do different models and modeling and different math. Yeah. So if we don't allow to do this, then we have a problem, I think, cognitively and intellectually. Yeah. But the real problem is now we have built a global system. For instance, on this climate discourse. Yeah. What would be the face-saving sort of means to withdraw, to say, look, perhaps we got it wrong? There is a perhaps we got it wrong. We got it wrong on gender, we got it wrong on climate, we got it wrong on COVID, we got it wrong on whatever, Ukraine, on Maidan, on. So I think there is a real problem for the West, let's say, the West. It's the Western countries capturing the truth or admitting that we may not be right. And I think that in broader political and intellectual terms is the topic on the table, and there is a problem for, let's call it the West, or the countries of the rule-based order, or whatever you call it, who have these problems. You don't have these problems in Belgrade. You don't have them in... May I say this? I was in St. Petersburg, yeah? I had a super conference, 50 scientific people on good and evil in European thought. The best academic conference I ever had, yeah? People from Sri Lanka reading Hegel and whatever. Really academics as we knew it 30 years ago, right? So I think there's also acknowledgement that the problem is our problem. It's not everywhere in the world. And for me, it has something to do with our face-saving non-capacity of recognition that we may get it wrong on essential points. How we look at the world, which data we need to process, which policies we want to run, which arguments we want to have. And if we don't allow this to be put into question, then I think the West, the so-called West, has a fundamental problem. And the problem is not in India. I just was in Bangalore. It's not in China. It's not in St. Petersburg. It's not in South Africa. It's just here. Yeah.
I would like to ask Jakob to respond with what he would recommend moving forward as somebody who heads an organization with the wonderful name, The Future of Free Speech, who is an expert has expertise in Germany and all the other countries, and recently had a very successful conference. So what encouragement can you give us, Jakob? Should we build on the model of Toby Young and the academic freedom legislation here? If not that, what else?
Can I also add, you made a very interesting point on the podcast I was listening to about the extent to which the kind of disinformation problem is exaggerated in order to kind of, as it were, because this in some ways ought to be a kind of golden age for free speech, with social media weakening the traditional sort of power brokers of information in our societies, but it's there's a sort of pushback against that in the sort of, well, do you want your children to be exposed to lies about medicines, or encouraged to commit suicide or whatever it is, But you had some really interesting facts and figures about the extent to which, this is a weapon in the hands of the old gatekeepers in some ways. Look, the disinformation wave is coming your way.
Yeah, to that latter point, so throughout the history of free speech, there's a tendency towards elite panic. That means whenever the public sphere is expanded, whether through new communications technology or when previously marginalized voices are being allowed into the public sphere, the traditional gatekeepers tend to fret about that. They tend to convince themselves that without their expertise, their control over information, society will erode. The basic foundations of democracy will erode. And I think that has been sort of part. We've seen that with traditional media. I mean, which is quite interesting, given that the printing press itself obviously was very disruptive to traditional gatekeepers for the time. Then the media, legacy media, became a gatekeeper, and then suddenly, when social media arrived, there was a lot of gnashing of teeth in traditional media about that. And I think universities, it's a bit of the same. Do you really? Are you comfortable living in a world where universities don't have the same automatic prestige and enlightened position in society as you'd have before, when suddenly other people, you can start a YouTube channel and you can suddenly challenge a professor or whatever is perceived wisdom on any given subject. And there's a lot of cranks out there, but there's also a lot of people who have very interesting ideas, who might actually be right on a given topic, and who might have more solid views, be more well-read than a professor on a certain issue. So that's sort of the revolt of the masses against the elite, which is very characteristic of our time. In terms of what to do, I think that there are some interesting initiatives. We have Pano in the room, who has founded the University of Austin in Texas. So that's sort of a way to sort of say, well, we can go outside the existing system. There are also work on sort of private accreditation of universities. So I think there's, and I think I like that approach, sort of saying we shouldn't lobby the government to sort of say, hey, we need laws to dictate what is being taught in curriculum. Things have gone too far in the woke direction. Now we need to have a new kind of orthodoxy imposed. I think that's an encouraging way. But that obviously also depends on legislation allowing for outside actors to come in and disrupt existing universities. I also think we need to look at history, even though my organization is called the Future of Free Speech. I think there's a lot to learn from history. There's sometimes this idea that academic freedom was always there, and then things went to hell 10 years ago. But if you go to the 1670s, students were flogged at Harvard for blasphemy. If you go to 1697, the last person who was executed in Britain was a student at the University of Edinburgh who was denounced by his fellow students and who testified against him. If one of the great scientists in Britain was Joseph Priestley, he was not able to attend Oxford or Cambridge because he was a nonconformist. He was a Unitarian, and his lab was smashed by a mob. He had to flee to the United States to pursue his career. And in the United States, at Harvard, Zechariah Chaffee, who was a great civil libertarian who had an enormous influence on the interpretation of the First Amendment, was someone who was very critical of the first Red Scare, sort of the tendency of the United States government to crack down on anyone who was opposed to American involvement in World War I. And the State Department colluded with some of his opponents at Harvard and put him on trial. He fortunately won and was able to keep his position. But all that, when we see that from our position today, we are shocked about those developments. We say, oh, that was outrageous, but it resonated at the time. At the time, there was a sort of orthodoxy. There was a prevailing opinion that a Joseph Priestley could not be at Cambridge or Oxford and should that his views were too outrageous because he supported the American and French Revolution, and he should not be someone who is allowed to pollute public debate. And I think we need to take that with us in today, and that goes into to what you're saying, that even if we ourselves do not agree with a particular theory that someone is advancing, it is incredibly valuable that we have institutions that are open to those, because very likely things that we believe in right now, most of us are likely to be very wrong, and people will look back on us and say, wow, they were incredibly misguided in 2025, and it was only that guy with a YouTube channel with 20,000 followers who was actually correct.
So the remedy for bad speech is more speech, not censorship, as Brandeis said. But
it's such a cliche.
Yeah.
But what the alternative is? What is the alternative? The alternative to
quote.
that is that free speech is a messy concept. Academic freedom is a messy concept. So it is part of the solution.
But talking of more speech, we got 15 or 20 minutes left, I think, Edward. So let's open it up to comments and questions from you guys. I suppose I should. Yeah, can you? Take that one. The guy by the pillar there was the first one I saw. We'll take a few questions. Just say who you are.
Sorry, Jim Butcher. I run the Kent branch of Academics for Academic Freedom. I just wanted the panellists, if they wanted to come back on the changing role of EDI, because one of the striking things for me is that we've had these legal victories, these legal changes, which have been good for us, and we have a free speech policy that talks about institutional neutrality. But we have the expansion of EDI at the same time as that, and it seems to me what's happening is that the role of EDI is changing from one of limiting free speech around sort of woke themes to saying, well, we need more EDI to manage the new free speech. If we're going to have free speech, if we're going to have academic freedom, we need to manage it. And sure enough, we have a good free speech policy, but due to the sort of role of EDI, we have 12 annexes attached to it. The annexes emphasise the whole kind of therapy culture element. You can have your free speech, but you've got to know how to chair it sensitively. You can have your free speech, but you've got to consult with all of these different groups and kind of do what they say. So it seems to me that I'm less optimistic perhaps than Toby was on that basis because of the sort of expansion of a sort of cultural norms and values in universities that have no educational values, looking for other values that limit things in other ways.
Thank you. I'm Sebastian Milbank from the Critic magazine. I guess my question is, I was in academia, I did my PhD, and my parents are both academics, and my impression of the sector is it has become astronomically more competitive than it used to be. There are twice as many PhDs as there used to be for not many more jobs. In fact, in many sectors, fewer jobs. And I wonder how much this culture, fear and censorship, is driven by the intensity of competition and the desperation of people to get ahead by advancing an ideology and the fear of losing a profession in a uniquely precarious field. Thank you.
The guy behind you, the tie.
Yeah, Lawrence Hemming, director of the Knapp Foundation, which is a private research institute. The one area that you've not touched on in academic freedom is the way in which the administrations in academic structures are being used to limit freedoms of academics. I'll give you one small example. This afternoon I have to go and give a lecture, and I've borrowed a room from another university next door, and I had to be prevent checked in order and submit my lecture plan in order to sit in a room with a laptop. Now, that and use a room in another institution's facilities. Very friendly. But my point is this, that there are technocratic processes that are being brought to bear which are exterminating academic freedom even before we get to many issues that you've raised today. And I'm extremely concerned to hear how we might address that.
Frank there, and then the lady in front here, and then we'll maybe.
Yes, Frank Ferretti. I think you're absolutely right, because before we worry about academic freedom, we have to look at the mechanics that have been introduced, and everything from learning outcomes to all the different promises you've got to make to your students are actually curbing your freedom to express your views in accordance with your inclination. But I think that there's a bigger problem. And I hate to be pessimistic, but I actually think that in my 45 years of being in a university, this is the worst moment of all. Because whatever happens on the legal domain, and I'm all for it, there nevertheless is a conformism that is so insidious, so deeply embedded, that there is no longer things that you can say. I cannot talk about Israel in a university setting, without inviting sometimes quite violent retribution. I cannot put forward a critique of transgender ideology without immediately provoking the most hateful, spiteful reactions. And I can give you 10 or 12 issues on which you have got to be silent. And in the last couple of months, I've talked to several academics who essentially have adopted the role of being monks, but they essentially keep their views to themselves. They feel, they may be wrong, but they feel they are totally isolated. They got no friends, and they have no bridges that they can cross to other kind of people. And I think we have to recognize that over this successive generation of academics, we created the kind of academic that no longer believes in academic freedom. That's the problem. It's not the rules or the laws. It's academics who really hate the idea of academic freedom and who loathe the idea that you can have open, spontaneous discussion and debate. And I draw the conclusion that if you want to have academic freedom, you got to step outside of the academy. Right? The only place where you can do that is stepping outside of the academy. So I just like to have you use whether I'm just being one-sided pessimist, or is there some truth in what I've said?
Lady in front here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Lovely panel. Alison Scott-Berman, I'm a professor at SOAS. Very short question, but I think it summarises some of the points that have been raised already. If the panel would agree that legislation is not enough, in other words, you can't force people into free speech, it's a contradiction in terms, then what are the supplementary, complementary devices that we should introduce into a sector which really, as we've heard, is really struggling? Thank you.
Do you want to quickly respond to any of the questions? Which if you want to respond to, then we may have time for another round.
I take the first question, this sort of economic pressure on your job, yeah? And in Germany, for instance, there's a huge, most academic positions now are 1 year or 2 year terms, which basically, if you don't silence yourself, you lose your job, even without being sanctioned. It's just like you don't get renewal of your working contract, yeah? So that's the best sort of measuring. On bureaucracy, I totally agree. It's all this technocracy thing which seems to be neutral, but which in itself is already censoring everything, yeah? And that because it's only bureaucracy and only control and only for our security, you cannot even voice it, yeah? And I agree with Frank, the best discussions are outside of academia, but I think I would just add a different angle, which is that because, there's something, and I can't go long on this here, but there's something with this digitalization and people no longer reading, no longer having haptic locations of their knowledge, or everything is in the internet. There's lots of neurological research that truly people lose thinking capacity, yeah? Because thinking has a room, which is a book, and you know on which page, and so on and so forth. So this digitalization, because when you are saying the best discussions are outside of academia, the different thing is the generational divide. If you look at 20 or 25 years old and their capacity to read a PDF or a book, or no longer book reading people, then it's not only which discussions you have out of academia, it's what is the educational cognitive training of our next generations. And I think there's something to look for if we go down neurological studies and the difference between reading in the internet and reading a book. There's really something to look for.
Yeah, I think that leadership at universities is a real difference maker. If you have brave leadership at an institution, if you have a university that is willing to not only say we live up to academic freedom, but actually institutionalizes it, and where the from the top down, says this is actually part of our DNA. That makes a huge difference to a university. If the administration has the back of faculty, even when they make controversial statements, if they don't punish students for controversial statements, that makes a huge difference. And it can be inspiring. It can inspire other institutions to say, well, we should move away from sort of a governance structure based on risk aversion and safetyism and get back to our core mission. And I think that is something that can make a difference. You make sort of a parallel to sort of in the 13th century when certain universities would ban Aristotle. Aristotle was way too dangerous, but then there were other universities that say, come here, you can study Aristotle, and that became a competitive advantage to have sort of open academic freedom. So I think that's one way to go for universities, and I think there are those universities in the US. I think Vanderbilt, where I am at, is a good example of a university that has gone down that road, and I think that is quite appealing to a lot, both of students, but also brilliant researchers who want to go there because it offers something different to other elite institutions that have gone in a different direction, where academic freedom is no longer a priority.
These are all terrific questions and comments, but for lack of time, I'm going to confine myself to two of them. First, Sebastian's point. I want to commend the scholarship of Musa Al-Gharbi, a brilliant social psychologist who has written a lot with a lot of data about how conformist those of us in academia are. I see some nodding heads here. We like to pride ourselves on being such original, creative, fearless thinkers. But in fact, he has documented all of the pressures that have guided us toward the path that ultimately culminates in a tenured professorship. And sadly, we are following a pattern that has guaranteed our success when we engage in self-censorship. So somehow we have to correct that. The only other point I would make, I'm so sorry I didn't get your name, Allison. Question about how do we change the culture, because having a terrific speech protective law is necessary but not sufficient, as we've said, and I think this was alluded to earlier. We have changed, and I think somebody out there made the point, we have changed the culture in other ways amazingly quickly. When we think about the pervasive training in anti-harassment, anti-bullying, pro-EDI or DEI, that transformation took place relatively quickly. So we can do a similar transformation, pervasive throughout every interaction that the university has with every member or every potential member, starting with the recruitment materials, the application essays, the orientation session, what syllabi are required to have, statements about academic freedom. In other words, an example of more speech or education.
To answer your question, Jim, about what to do about the free speech policy being silted up and caveated by all these EDI requirements, it sounds to me like you might be able to legally challenge Kent for trying to caveat the free speech policy in this way, and talk to alumni for academic freedom who are very good at legally challenging suspect policies which seem to militate against the new free speech protections. More generally, Frank, I think you're right. There doesn't seem to be a huge appetite for academic freedom and free speech on many university campuses amongst many of your colleagues. Why is that? I think it's partly they've become accustomed to fighting political, ideological battles in this kind of crab-like, sideways, indirect way. Listening to your story, Ulrike, clearly you were a heretic. You had trespassed on the sacred values of the institutions you were associated with, but rather than engage with you in a good faith discussion about those values, much better to pretend your only sin was to commit factual errors in this non-academic book. And in the climate change debate, you see exactly the same modus operandi. Rather than acknowledge that there are legitimate scientific debates to be had about things like the causes of extreme weather events, the Arctic ice, polar bears, etc. It's all their opponents are just climate change deniers. They're in the pay of the oil and gas industry. Misinformation. I mean, there's this pretense that if you depart from the kind of radical, progressive, ideological consensus, it's not because there's a difference in the values you subscribe to, it's because you've been misinformed by bad actors, you've been led astray. If only you had the correct information, you would agree with these folks. Just finally, I passed a sign outside Imperial College's new sparkling white city campus, and there was actually a flag hanging over the street in the entranceway saying, "Follow the science." This pretense that it's all, if you follow the science, you'll end up in the same radical, progressive utopia as the rest of us. They don't like academic freedom because they've lost the muscle to actually defend the values they believe in. And I think it's partly those muscles have atrophied. It's partly, I think, reflects a loss of faith. As the faith in those values collapses, so the institutions based on them become more and more brittle. They're more likely to lash out. They don't want a good faith public debate. They don't want more speech because they don't know how to conduct themselves. They don't know. They've forgotten how to defend what it is they believe in.
I wonder whether another there are sort of bigger background factors is also the shift in our politics from a politics, a post-war period that was primarily socio-economic to a politics that is much more cultural, psychological, related to people's identities, identity politics, and that leads to the belief that, particularly in liberal circles, that liberal societies with significant value diversity can only remain peaceful by suppressing speech. I mean, I think that is sort of one of the things that drives the belief that actually suppression of speech is a good thing, because it's a necessary condition of peaceful coexistence in societies with a huge amount of diversity. Have we got time for... No. Oh, sorry. Well, anyway, can we say thank you to our panel members?